Hello, everybody. I'm Jerry Baker, editor-at-large with the Wall Street Journal. I'm here with Larry Summers, whom you all know, of course, distinguished economist, academic, former Secretary of the Treasury, various other important roles in his life, and very much engaged in the intellectual life of the nation and the world. Larry, we're just a few days away now from presidential election. If I could start with that, I want to get on with to talk to you about some longer term economic issues too, but this election is looming very large in everybody's lives. Seems to be going down to the wire, seems fairly close. What in your view, you've served in the last two Democratic administrations. Current betting seems to be that Joe Biden is the favorite and will be forming another administration sometime in the new year. What's your sense? What is your view of what's at stake in this election?
I think some important continuities of American policy that run through Democratic and Republican administrations alike. A sense of community towards the world and a recognition that relations between nations are not a zero-sum game where everything that's good for another country is bad for the United States. That's very much a difference in perspective. A sense of whether America moves forward best when Americans are united together to meet challenges, or moves forward best when some Americans are enabled to act out their resentment against other Americans, cheered on by the President of the United States, national community, and a sense of whether decisions are best made by reason or by passion, by gut instinct or by experts. I think the American tradition is one of decision-making based on reason. Those were the Enlightenment values that the Founding Fathers brought us, built on an effort to bring all Americans together. That's been the national project, for better or for worse, and sometimes it's worked better than other times since the Civil War. And the idea that American foreign policy is based on a better world for the United States, which is likely to come about with a better world through all the other peoples. Those have been enduring premises of our society, and those have been brought very much under challenge by the policy of the last 4 years, which has been aberrant from the perspective of any governing tradition in the United States that I know. Yes, it's the tradition of George Wallace, who was third-party candidate in the 1960s. It was the tradition of various peripheral figures who challenged Franklin Roosevelt, like Father Coughlin. But as a governing tradition, it's something new in the United States, and I think very, very unfortunate.
There are a lot of people who regard Joe Biden. Joe Biden's been in public life in America, national politics for pretty well 50 years. Senator, vice president, seen, I think, is probably pretty much in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And there are many people, I think, who see a Biden administration as a kind of a restoration, sort of as what you just described as as a return from what you just described as an aberrant period that we've been through for the last 4 years, and that we'll somehow get back onto the track of global liberalism and support for global institutions and all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's also fair to say the Democratic Party, there are others in the Democratic Party who perhaps don't view either of the administrations, for example, that you served in, particularly as a kind of model for what they want the Democratic Party to go back to. We saw a very lively debate in the primaries where you had self-identified socialists, and you've got a Democratic Party platform, whatever Joe Biden's past may be, which is in many respects notably more progressive, as the word is, on issues like environment, healthcare. There's increasing talk about some fairly radical measures, constitutional type measures, such as regards to the Supreme Court. How do you see a potential Biden administration? Is it going to be kind of a restoration, a kind of business as normal, the Democratic Party back to where it was? or are we seeing? Do we need to see this as as an evolved Democratic Party adapting to the changed circumstances today, and a party that may be, frankly, just much more radical and much more progressive than we've seen at any point in the last 30 or 40 years?
I think the world has changed. It's changed on a whole set of dimensions. You see corporate CEOs talking about inequality and vowing to run their companies for the benefit of stakeholders. You see central bankers around the world taking a very different view than they did before about budget deficits. You see a concern with issues of opportunity and inequality. Yes, Jerry, even on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, in a way that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. So I don't think any U.S. administration is going to return to where we were. History is a river, not a lake, and it flows. And certainly, Joe Biden is someone who will flow with it. So on a whole range of issues, I mean, it was a radical idea, quite radical idea, when Joe Biden came out explicitly for gay marriage 10 years ago. So I don't think that you're going back to where we were 10 or 20 years ago. And those of us who served in the Obama and Clinton administrations, while proud of our records, see the world as having changed on a large number of dimensions. At the same time, I think it behooves one to recognize that Joe Biden ran from the beginning as a moderate. He didn't let himself get pushed far off his initial positions in the course of the campaign period, stressed in the debate that now he was the Democratic Party, emphasized that he had beaten the voices of a further left-wing perspective. So as I look to a Biden presidency, I certainly don't see any kind of restoration on many dimensions, given the ways in which all of us see the world differently, because the world has changed, not necessarily because we were wrong then, but because the world has changed. There is much more inequality. Interest rates are much lower. The relations between nations are very different. The issues of disaffection of elites are much, much more important. So it will be different. But I don't find the claim that Joe Biden at this point in his career is going to morph into some kind of socialist radical to be remotely plausible. I think it could reasonably be said that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were heirs to the George McGovern tradition. I think that's an inconceivably implausible thing to say about Joe Biden.
Let's look at the economic challenges that whoever, assuming it is Joe Biden, but whoever takes office, whoever becomes president in January, faces. Interestingly, of course, you served in the Obama administration, which came into office in January of 2009, right in the middle of the deepest recession that we'd seen since the 1930s, and you were very much involved, obviously, in the policymaking response, the fiscal policy response, particularly to that, and some of the regulatory responses to that. How does the situation this time around differ from that? Obviously, we are in this very unusual circumstance. We've just had a huge decline in GDP in the second quarter. We're going to get a huge increase in GDP when the numbers come out for the third quarter, leaving us still, however, some significant way below where we were as we enter 2021. There are those who say this is a V-shaped recovery. It's all about COVID. Once we get a vaccine in place, once kind of things return to some sort of normality, everything's going to be fine. And sometime in the middle of next year, we'll recover the lost output and things will be fine. I'm just guessing you don't take that view. But so how assess for us the economic challenge that the country faces moving into 2021?
First of all, there is just a very simple arithmetic point that most people don't recognize, which is if something goes down by 40% and then it goes up by 40%, it's 16% below where it was before. And so I think there's a failure to recognize that. And that if one looks at the number of extra unemployed people or the amount of unused capacity in the American economy, it is really a very substantial amount. And I think that requires people to reckon with it. I think providing continuous stimulus to the economy is a kind of necessary insurance. It's possible that it's unnecessary. That would not be my best guess, but it certainly is possible. And if so, the stimulus will phase out in a few months. The inflation rate will have been brought more rapidly, more close to 2%. I don't think any great harm will be done. On the other hand, not providing any stimulus to the economy is a little bit like walking around in a crowd these days without wearing a mask. It's taking a chance you may well come to regret. And it seems to me that why would we want to do the experiment of the greatest withdrawal of fiscal stimulus since the end of the Korean War? Why would we want to do that experiment right now as a country? So I'm pretty convinced of the importance of further fiscal stimulus. I'm sympathetic to concerns about having it be as productive as possible on the supply side. I'm more worried than some of my friends about possible disincentive effects, depending on how it's designed.
Sorry, could you just be a little specific on that? You mean, so how would you, what would be the most effective, most efficient stimulus?
I'd like to see us start moving towards employing people repairing the infrastructure. I'd like to see us moving towards employing people in hospitals and schools that have been closed down. I'd like to see us employing people in contact tracing and testing, administering that would contribute to putting COVID behind us.
What's the, you as you say, that it seems the balance of risks here in terms of going for another significant stimulus and not going for one does seem to be weighted in favor of the former. What do you make of this argument, though, that does seem to be quite prevalent, especially on the left, that we are in an environment now, low interest rates, low inflation, tremendous amounts of excess capacity in the economy, and that there is pretty well unlimited fiscal room for maneuver. We've already seen, debt to GDP ratio is above 100% now. Just a few years ago, Larry, there were people who would sort of, get their worry beads out when with that kind of a number. People, sustainable number was thought maybe to be 60, 70, 80% of GDP. We're now over 100 and talking about going to 120, 130. What do you make of this argument that, to be really honest, I don't, by all means, we can talk about modern monetary theory and MMT, and I know you've written pretty critically about that, but what are the limits here to an economy the size and the scale and the relative openness of the United States in terms of in the current climate, in terms of the optimal fiscal? Is there an optimal debt number? Is there an optimal fiscal policy that can be done here? Or frankly, can we just do whatever we want?
I think optimal depends on circumstances. Think about how large a house a family with a given income can afford. I think most of us would say that how big a house can you buy based on your income depends on the context. It depends on what the interest rate is and what the mortgage service is. Depends on what other expenses you're going to have. Depends on how fast you think your income's going to grow. Depends on whether you think you're going to improve the house or when you're living in it, or whether you're not going to improve the house. And I take the same kind of perspective to the budget deficit. And so I look at what fraction of our GDP we were paying in debt service. I look at what that was a few years ago and see that we're way, way below that. And I don't think we have anxiety at the current level. I think that we've got much more to fear from a double dip recession than we do from somehow an excessive accumulation of government debt. I think the conventional wisdom, the great and the good, have for the most part not appreciated what is going to be the central macroeconomic problem of the next half generation and maybe whole generation. And that is that because of increased inequality, because of increased uncertainty, the private economy is generating much more saving. And because information technology is basically so cheap, because we're figuring out how to use capital so much more efficiently, think work at home, think Uber, think Airbnb, we are going to have a chronic excess of saving over investment. We are going to have to figure out how to use that saving in productive ways and absorb it. Or if not, that excess saving is going to fall on reduced levels of demand, which are going to mean lower levels of income, which are going to mean further reductions in demand. And the situation of absorbing saving is very different in the world of today when you're starting with a chronic excess than in the world of a couple of decades ago when you might have had a chronic shortage of saving manifest in high interest rates.
You've written a lot about these issues, excess of savings. You've written a lot about secular stagnation, idea that obviously first kind of articulated in the 1930s. I want to give us a sense of, COVID hit at a time when, despite relatively healthy economic performance, especially in terms of, as measured in terms of, labor utilization, the unemployment rate was at a remarkably low period, but it came at a period when the US and other Western economies have been in this prolonged period of relatively weak growth historically, low productivity, slowing labor force growth. Give us a sense of what the extent to which COVID how does COVID impact that? Does it make it? Is it going to be an event that just comes and goes and passes, and we're going to be left with those continual issues? How much scarring will there be in the economy from COVID? How much will COVID exacerbate some of those longer term factors? Give us your sense of where we were in kind of structural secular economic performance and how COVID might affect that.
I think this problem of chronic excess private saving was looming as a problem. The Fed kept trying to raise rates to normal levels and kept not being able to. That was a giveaway of its seriousness. Real rates turned negative or close to negative throughout the industrial world. I think COVID's made it worse. It's made it worse because it's increased uncertainty, which increases savings, and probably increased inequality, which increases savings, because it's interfered with credit extension, which means there's more debt paying back, which is a form of savings. And it's made everybody much less certain of where things are going, which has reduced investment. And it's probably resulted in a demassification of the economy, our working at home and Zooming rather than traveling to offices and working. So I think it has been an exacerbant, both on the increased savings side and on the reduced investment side, which makes solving these problems that much more urgent.
Let's talk briefly. We've got a few minutes left. Talk briefly about monetary policy, if we may. The Fed, again, this is an international audience, so we can talk a little bit about the global environment, but the Fed is obviously just in the last few months formally shifted to kind of what it was informally doing, which is broadly speaking, a much more accommodative approach, taking
I think it's probably the right thing to have done, but it's an essential irrelevance. Interest rates are, I'm sorry, go ahead,
yeah.
Jerry.
No, I wanted to ask a specific, I always say that, but I want to ask a particular issue, which is about the financial stability question. Obviously the goals of monetary policy are very clearly now, all the levers are being pulled to promote employment, lack of concern about inflation. But we are seeing we are seeing the rise of some financial imbalances, perhaps in the economy. How much, as the Fed or as monetary policymakers around the world consider this and doing whatever they can as put to the floor in terms of promoting growth, how much of a concern should the objective of financial stability be? How worried would you be about it?
I'd be worried about financial stability, but monetary policy wouldn't be my tool. My tool would be assuring that institutions were adequately capitalized, would be assuring that there was some kind of appropriate regulation of the shadow banking system. I mean, God knows how many times does the United States have to be burned by money market funds to learn our lesson with respect to money market funds.
Let's talk very quickly about, again, international economics. Again, if there is a Biden presidency, what do you think the Trump administration has pursued this generally aggressive approach towards China, differing from the approach taken by the administration you served in, and indeed the Bush administration? What do you expect in terms of that relationship, that economic relationship and broader strategic?
I think it's going to be vexed. It's almost structurally inherent in the situation of China's substantial progress that it would be vexed. And I think there are important respects in which China has not lived by agreements that it has made, and that those should be pursued. But I think that those issues can be managed at much lower temperature than they've been managed. And I think it has not served American interests or Chinese interests or the world's interests for the temperature to have been dialed up in the way that it has been in the last months.
And on that larger question of globalization, which again, we've seen populist pressures perhaps pushing back against. Again, would a Biden administration kind of attempt to put that genie back in the bottle? Would you expect to see,
I'd expect much more recognition that the United States succeeds or fails along with other countries, and that the vision that somehow we're going to have a highly prosperous American economy and a deeply depressed global economy is not a serious vision. And therefore, I would expect to see policies much more oriented to mutual prosperity, even if that, and that those are the better policies to pursue, rather than policies that somehow suppose that whenever we export more, that's good, and whenever we import more, that's bad, which is a kind of economic thinking that went out in civilized circles 200 years ago.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you a slightly different question. And you will doubtless say that as somebody who works at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, I probably perhaps tend to overstate this problem. But you served as president of Harvard University, an extraordinarily distinguished career in academia as well as in policymaking. We've seen, I think it's fair to say, developing over quite a long period of time, and by the way, you dealt with some of these issues when you were president of Harvard, and a climate in which there does seem to be a growing intolerance of views that fall outside what could be called a kind of progressive orthodoxy, critical race theory and woke theory and all this other stuff that we talk about. Again, you have dealt with this directly yourself, and I'm sure that people like us on the editorial page maybe overstate it. But how troubled are you? But we've seen many more instances of that, particularly in the last few months, both in the media and in academia. How troubled are you about this attempt to exclude, suppress heterodox views in public discourse?
I think stifling intolerance on university campuses, arising both from misguided administrative actions and from widely shared social norms, are an immense threat to the American project. I think it is possible that the very limited range of discourse that is permitted on politically sensitive subjects on American campuses today will be viewed 50 years from now in the same way that the McCarthyist era suppression of progressive ideas on university campuses is viewed. I think John Stuart Mill had it exactly right on the subject of vigorous argument, that even if what is being argued is wrong, and even if you are confident that it is wrong, those in possession of the right views will hold them more securely and more effectively if they have been exposed to meaningful challenge. And so I think that this is a profound threat to the education and acculturation of future leaders of our country. If you look at the fraction of Supreme Court justices, the fraction of presidents, fraction of members of the Congress and Senate who have had significant formative experiences in leading universities, I think what happens there is something that is immensely important and immensely troubling. And I have to say that with a rather limited number of exceptions, it seems to me the current leadership of leading American universities have done more to promote the limiting of orthodoxy than to open the space for debate.
Barry Summers, that's a very good note and a very important warning and injunction on which to end. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all for listening.